Editorials. The economic problem. The problem of human equality is ever confronting us. The Master Jesus said, "The poor ye have with you always." And technically this is true. There will never be a time in nature when all things shall be equal. The only equality is when things are equal to themselves. Just as there is childhood, manhood, and old age, birth, growth, and decay, so there are 3 stages in the progression of consciousness through matter. There are 3 grand divisions of organic quality in bodies. 2 things are necessary for expression in matter, and all expression is limited by these 2 things. First, organic quality, and second, size. Size is the measurement of power, all things being equal. A size without high organic quality produces the brute. An organic quality without size produces those sensitive individuals who seldom live to great age because the fine-grained quality cannot be supported by a small undeveloped body. As long as there is difference in organic quality and size, there cannot be equality in mental or social position, because man's expression in this world is the direct result of the power which consciousness is exerting over matter. Where the organic quality is low, consciousness is low, and the brain is incapable of fine discriminating thought. Such persons must follow instead of lead, for the very structure of their organism inhibits intelligent leadership. When such individuals do rise to power, we have the Marat, the Robespierre, the Napoleon, or the radical who is incapable of reflective thought himself and refuses to credit reflective thought to others. Man has an impossible golden dream which he has fostered for a long time, and that is that he is going to tear down the so-called caste system, and that the man with the pick and shovel is going to sit in meditation with the sage, while the bricklayer is going to recline in the carven chairs of arrogance. This is a mistaken idea. The desire of the true ethical and social reformer does not rest upon these conditions at all. His cry is for opportunity, for the true philosopher realizes that opportunity is the divine birthright of all living creatures. And he also knows that the modern economic situation does not give every man an honest opportunity. The average reformer, however, becomes Bolshevistic. He is not satisfied with an opportunity, but demands affluence as his birthright. And the average soapbox orator along these lines would be more arrogant and despotic than those he condemns, if the goddess of finance ever smiled upon him. The sweatshops, child labor, and similar institutions are depriving man of his birthright, and as such should go. And with them depart the greatest curse of modern civilization. But the abolishment of these things will not equalize human intelligence. The thing it will do is give man an opportunity to unfold himself according to what he is. But he is always limited in 2 ways. First, by surrounding environments. Secondly, by organic quality. Man's greatest hindrance is not a heartless world, but a useless body. Useful bodies are not built in days or years, but in ages and lives. Organic quality cannot be improved by politics. It can only be improved by man as an individual when he makes the most of every opportunity to improve himself mentally, spiritually, and physically while he lives. There is a caste system in nature. In the universe, there is the upper and the lower set, divided from each other by the ideals and works of life and by the conscientious effort of each individual. Man must learn to be contented to live in accordance with what he is, and yet at the same time be ambitious to improve his lot. The hope of the universe is not in ranting and raving for equal rights, but in the burning of the midnight oil. When we see the laborer come from his labors, tired, surrounded by the crying needs of family and friend, but who sits alone under the light, studying to improve himself, working with tired, chapped fingers, roughened with toil to become a man among men, to learn the things which divide ignorance from wisdom. Such a one is the hope of salvation. Such a one will become, in the due course of nature's time, a spiritual aristocrat, and naturally, there will come to him his birthright of being a thinker, a doer, and a superior. Then we see his companion in labor, one who does not take the somber course of study and thought, but throws bricks at the houses of aristocrats, hating them because their skins are white while his are tanned, their voice is soft while his is harsh. He curses and spits at them, suffering in his hate. Such a one will never be the thing he longs to be, because the difference lies in quality and not in the strength of the bull or the beast within. If you entered two horses in a race, the one a dray, such as is used to pull milk wagons, and the other a fine Arabian stallion, which would win the race? Just so it is the same in the race for success. The dray horse is hampered by its own weight, and while it may dash forward madly with all the strength that is in it, it simply cannot race, no matter whether it is dragging a milk wagon or is a pedigreed horse. It is that type, and there is no hope for it. But the Arabian stallion, without an effort, outdistances it with ease and grace and leaves it far behind. Man believes that with the power of his hand he can rule the world. He cannot. All he can do is tear civilization up by the roots and leave it for another thinker to repair. We will not deny that the poor have cause for dissension, just as they had during the French Revolution. For the mere fact that a man has a fine, executive brain does not prove that he is a humanitarian, a philanthropist, or an honest man, nor does organic quality necessarily indicate virtue. But one thing it always does give, and that is power. It may be that an assassin's bullets will slay a few, but in the end the power of mentality wins over the battle of brawn, and the only hope for those who are trampled on is to reach mental efficiency by means of which they can intelligently combat conditions. When we look carefully into the problem of economics, we strike one phase that is well worth our consideration. Those individuals who now spend their time trampling on the poor were in nearly every case poorly born themselves. They did not come from homes of wealth, and many of them never went to school. Some of our greatest millionaires today were newsboys without a chance. Others shined shoes and started it with 100% less than the average failure starts with. The heel of capitalism of their day was upon their throats, and yet with the sheer force of mental power, indomitable will, and perfect faith in themselves, they rose out of the mud and became masters of world affairs. Now those left behind shake their fists at them, while the energy they use in railing would lift them also from the rut if it were exerted as their opponents exerted it. Man must learn to capitalize upon himself. His brain, his heart, and his hands are the most valuable assets he possesses. Incessant effort should be made to increase the efficiency of these assets, for in that alone lies liberation from the rut. When to this is added the realization of limitation and the gradual unfoldment of powers as the means of liberation from this limitation, we have the man or woman who is going to be a success. The caste system of the world is as follows. 1. The lowest phase is opposition, materialism, and the battling of beast instincts. In this world, they are the ones chained by ages of thoughtlessness, a recent differentiation from lower races, to the lower physical side of life. Those who dwell in it are chained by like and dislike, by passions and appetites. They deify matter and know no God or consciousness outside of it. They settle their disputes with bullets and sandbags or with fist encounters. They are an ever-muttering horde, and in the last analysis are absolutely powerless. Their only weapon is firebrand or dagger, and these things have no force outside of physical substance. And as true consciousness is independent of substance, the most they can do is destroy their own world. The mere idea that such individuals could rule the universe is beyond reason or logic. They cannot do it, for there is not within their own beings enough self-control to rule themselves. There is no law or logic in them, and as the universe is ruled by law and logic, only those who have developed it are capable of governing. They cry out in their agony that they are imposed upon. And they are, for man has not yet gained that consciousness which enables him to be superior without becoming domineering. The reason, however, why they are imposed upon is not necessarily because their opponents are strong, but because they themselves are weak. The idea that this problem can be solved without intellectual growth on the part of this great mass is absurd. Their overlords realize that in this ignorance lies the power which they have over them. Therefore, it seems that every day the higher oppress the lower more severely to prevent them from attaining light. But this oppression should only stimulate those oppressed to greater and more intelligent effort. The world must have those who work with their hands, but these will always have to serve the man who works with his head, while both must bow together before the one is expressing the qualities of his spirit. 2. The second stage is intellectualism, and it spends most of its time preying upon materialism. These are the minds that juggle the finance of the world, that lead, govern, and direct the mass, and regardless of what they may like or dislike, those who would lead or govern must join this second class. The great curse of intellectualism is oppression, for there are very few capable of realizing their power over others with attempting to exert it. This is the main cause of the sorrow of the masses. In other words, man's inhumanity to man. The intellectual individual should appoint himself as guardian and protector of those incapable of functioning on that plane. But instead of doing so, he now harnesses them to his chariot and loads their backs with burdens. The only real remedy for this is to awaken in him the realization of his responsibilities. 3. The third division is that of the spiritual man, which is the principle of altruism and selflessness. There are but few who have consciously attained this degree. They are the great reformers, the great occultists and thinkers of our world who have realized the oneness of things and have come to an understanding of the fact that while all cannot attain in one life the acme of their ideals, still man should not impose upon the weak, but rather should champion them and assist them to a fuller and more adequate position. We have an idea that we are living in civilized times, but this idea is eternally being shattered by every evident example of barbarism. Voltaire said, "I know I am among men because they are fighting. I know they are civilized because they fight so savagely." Our so-called evolved and developed peoples are at each other's throats. Our great inventors spent all their time learning how to kill, and competition had been crowned the life of trade. This is purely because man has accepted the science of economics as the worthwhile thing in life. It is undoubtedly the world's most foolish decision. Man must not deify this problem as he does because in nature it holds the least important place. Neither must we reject the economic problem. It is to be neither accepted nor rejected, and under no conditions assumed. It is merely here as an examination or test of the consciousness of man. In other words, it exists only to be solved. The wonderful Hindu race as a nation has never accepted the economic problem as worthy of consideration, and of course they did not have to in the time of their glory, for economics have always been seen as a secondary consideration in the Orient. The modern problem did not confront the ancient races, and yet they were far better able to meet it than we are. The masters did not live in the day when caste was king. They needed only to seat themselves upon the ground, and their people gathered around them. When they wanted a house, they built it where they chose and lived in it. While if they were tired of the bustle of the world, they entered a cave in the hills. If they possessed no sandals, it was perfectly fashionable to go barefoot, and they never met the great inconveniences of modern congestion. As a result of their freedom, we find primitive brotherhood, many examples of which are far more beautiful than the products of our modern ethics. The Masonic school symbolizes the stages of unfoldment as the 3 ages of man: youth, maturity, and old age. The ages of the soul are the same. There are in the world today young souls in old bodies and old souls in young bodies. Youth goes out to conquer the world. Manhood is content to have sufficient for his needs, while old age renounces the world as an illusion. We may call youth the material man, adultness the intellectual man, old age the spiritual man. Applying the economic problem, we may say, to the material man it is all, to the intellectual man it is a problem, to the spiritual man it is an illusion. To the ancients, the economic problem was a phase. To the modern mind, with its greed and ambition, it is an all-absorbing reality. The young soul starts out on its journey in matter as an egotist, and the keynote of its consciousness is to acquire. Regardless of cost, it must own, master, and break all other things. This is the key to the economic problem, which in the average mind becomes merely a series of processes for acquirement. The old soul has no economic problem, for it has ceased to desire to acquire. For eyes growing dim to material things have become to see the reality hidden behind the veil. The old soul realizes that we are here to master problems as they are presented by nature, and are never to dally with them, but to go straight through to a successful conclusion. There are over 1,000 solutions to the modern economic problem, but when applied, they are all at best only partial solutions, and the great key problem remains unsolved. Many of us would like to wander with Plato and Aristotle over the mountains of eternity, but we are forcibly drawn back again into the world by the economic needs. We are forced to leave our philosophy and go back into the world, both as teachers and pupils, to earn the money for our daily bread. India solved the problem of education in the face of economic difficulties by dividing the life of man into 3 epochs. The first 25 years he was supported by his parents and usually graduated from one of the many universities, which, in the days of India's glory, made it the most highly educated country in the world. During his youth, provision was made for his life. He was prepared to think for himself in a rational and sensible way. Then came the second 25 years, during which he married and brought up his children, bringing them to a position where they could take care of themselves, and saving up sufficient to provide for his own old age, and those dependent upon him. Then, during the third part of his life, he retired from the bustle of the commercial world and devoted his entire time to study and philosophy, and the solution of life's problems, supported either by that which he had saved or the assistance of his children. The entire economic problem of the physical universe is an expression of matter, and the solution to it can be found in human anatomy, where 3 worlds of consciousness express themselves in the mental, emotional, and physical centers of the body. A civilization based on the lower man would express all the qualities of the animal instincts. For example, a carving from Mexico linking this country with ancient Egypt, accompanied by a marvelous description from the pen of a famous geologist, was presented to a newspaper for publication. It was thrown into the wastebasket, while 10 columns were given to a murder because the human animal reads only that in which he is interested. And while man is so attuned, he is interested only in the loves, joys, hates, and fears of animal consciousness. The same is true on each one of the 3 planes. We see all things with the eyes built of the organic quality of our vehicles. In man's anatomy, there are 4 elements: earth, water, fire, and air, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and oxygen, mediums through which this universe manifests concretely. In the economic problem, there are 4 elements: land, transportation, exchange, and integrity, which are the basis of economics. Land corresponds to the physical body of man, or the principle of earth, and is the skeleton of economics. The second, or water element, corresponds to the etheric body of man, and in economics is the problem of transportation, which consists of the drawing of raw materials to advantageous markets. The third element of fire, or medium of exchange, is the astral body, with the heart in its center, and the Christ, the sun principle, its Lord, ruling through the metal gold, which at the present time the medium of exchange. The fourth element is air, the mental quality, and in the economic problem, the integrity of the buyer and seller. These four constitute the body of the economic problem. Man tries to solve the problem of this body by placing one part over the other as master, while the intelligent, spiritualized individual realizes that all of these are vehicles for the expression of something else. There will be no end to the economic difficulties until the quality of the soul rises out of the four elements of body and transmute the present masters into the servants that they should be. There is no cure-all to apply to any world problem. These great tests of the intelligence of man must be met individually and mastered individually. Power remains in the hands of those who are able to wield it, whether for good or ill, and the surest way to equalize power is for each human being to prove worthy of that power. When all men have earned the right to think, they can think, but there is no glory in attacking the thinker of today save in one way. The thoughts of the modern thinker are selfish, egotistic, and enslaving. Let the new thinkers, born out of the darkness of their present sorrow, turn not around and oppress the oppressor, which is the temperament of the best, but let them show the superiority which they have gained by being charitable where others were not, by being noble where others were not, by being true where others were false, and in this way fulfill the dictates of true civilization. This universal understanding, based upon the realization of universal need, is the only permanent answer to any great problem. Editorials are demigods. For some apparently unknown reason, this year's crop of initiates is an exceptionally large one. But with an increase of supply, there is a tremendous decrease in market valuation. And really, at this time, the supply of initiates greatly exceeds the demand. It must be a grand and glorious feeling to be an initiate, so far above the rest of humanity that only occasionally the world is seen through a rift in the clouds. But we fear it must be rather chilly and lonely up there, and the rarefied atmosphere must be trying upon the lungs of our enlightened. It may be this mental or spiritual strain that is responsible for some of the peculiar things they do. There are at the present time a number of high priests of sundry and varied shrines, cults, isms, oxys, etc., who bestow upon you various initiations for various considerations. Let me introduce you to the fruitage of one of these marvelous processes, the Right Honorable Siomedes Sourdough, COD, FOB, SOS, RFD, PO, RSVP, IOU, BVD. This individual is an initiate of the first water, exceptionally brilliant, a member of everything and a leading authority on a large variety of subjects. He spends quite a percentage of his time preparing for his degrees, and the rest of the time getting over them. He admits that he is an initiate, and can show you checkbook stubs to prove it. He bestows initiation himself by the laying on of hands and exhorting the most terribly binding oath to the Lord's know-what. From all over the surface of the earth people come to gain wisdom at his feet. Mr. Dub came from Arkansas, Mr. and Mrs. Simp from Rhode Island, Betty Boop from North Dakota, and Willie It from Utah. All of these entered into the occult path under the guidance and guardianship of our much alphabeted friend, Professor Sourdough. Professor writes books, meets with an inner circle, and is perfectly willing to be admired. But really, this person has read a few good books and is capable of delivering a rational lecture on several subjects. But when a careful analysis is made of him and the acid test applied, he turns green. He would have been a very successful teacher and a great help to humanity if two things had not occurred. First, someone told him he was an initiate. And secondly, he believed it. There are several of our leading occult schools that have installed spiritual mimeographs in order to keep up with the ever-advancing and unfolding efficiency system, a sort of an occult sausage machine into one end of which are poured perfectly respectable citizens, and out the other end of which comes a never-ending stream of overstuffed sausages. A trip to Europe or some distant country is almost certain to result in an initiation, especially if you go to the right parties. And within the last few years, thousands of promising students have been turned into self-conceited puppies by a set process of initiation. Briefly, it is as follows. An individual who does not know tells another individual what he does not care anything about, then amputates one extremity from the bankroll, and this constitutes the essence of the ceremony. Initiate number 1 is a dope fiend, an inveterate smoker, and one of his best pictures shows him tenderly embracing one of the Vestal virgins of his temple. Number 2 has been tied up in so many scandalous enterprises that it is absolutely impossible to list them separately. But suspect him of anything you want and you are sure to hit it. Initiate number 3 carries a sideline in oil stock. Initiate number 4 is wanted for bigamy in 3 states. Initiate number 5 is wanted on sundry strange charges, while Initiate number 6 will have to explain several things to the government, which does not care much for him nowadays. Go right straight down the calendar of the 10 Commandments, and we can produce, with very little research work, an initiate who is morally, if not physically, breaking each one of them. And oh, the advice with which they delight the heart of the seeker, and oh, the esoteric instructions which they launch upon the unsuspecting world. Let us cite some examples of it. In the esoteric instructions to pupils written by one of these deluded individuals, we find the following suggestion as a very excellent means of developing clairvoyance, which, by the way, is not a legitimate spiritual aim, but is only legitimate as the result of the living of a pure life. But this individual gives the following process for the attainment of this supernatural vision, the unfoldment of soul qualities, and so forth. Take a mirror and hang on your wall so that when you are sitting down, the center of the mirror is on a level with your eyes. You are to put a lighted candle on each side of the mirror and then gaze into it until something happens. This is an exceptionally choice piece. What would the shades of the immortals have to say about it? If you look into this mirror long enough, you will see things. One student tried it, became hypnotized by his own eyes, could not look away from the mirror, and finally, frothing at the mouth, fell in convulsions. This is purely the result of the blind leading the blind, but people have done it and are doing it. They sit down every night and gaze in a piece of glass because the person who outlined the instruction claimed to be the one and only true initiate, the Lord High Mogul of this, that, and the other thing, and the Lord Emir most everything. Leaving this one to gaze in his magic mirror, we pass on to the next one. Henry Brown was a promising boy and a marvelous student of things supernatural. His lectures were clean-cut and interesting. His work was filled with promise, and there was no reason to doubt that one of these days, in the normal tenor of things, he would become at least an initiate of the lower orders. But this person was talked out of this straight and narrow way by one of the near initiates who received him into some deep and mysterious order which he swallowed whole. He now returns to the field of his labors absolutely useless, honestly believing that he is an initiate. All that we now have of our once promising possibility is a narrow-minded, highbrow fop who looks down with benign condescension upon the world at large. And so it goes wherever we look. Every little while, someone comes up to us and points out some long-eared, bewhiskered individual, whispering confidentially in our ear, "Shh, he is an initiate." When we mildly ask who told them so, they usually answer, "Oh, he admits it." Of all the occult teachers who have come to the world in late years, there are two who admitted before the world that they were just students, hoping with their own pupils that someday they would attain to the divine light. It would not be well to name them here, but they were great because they claimed nothing for themselves and only worked silently, quietly, and simply for the good of the cause. All over the face of the earth, strange individuals are being attacked with illusions, delusions, and confusions. The reincarnation of the Holy Ghost is now loose while there are hundreds preaching the one and only truth. all different. Each one is being sponsored by a master, and each one sets in by making a layer out of all the rest. And so it goes. We are producing in occultism a generation of delirious demigods who will never be of any real good to anybody until they get down off their high horses and come back to earth, where they are chained by every possible tie. If students could only learn to realize that to be a good student is as worthy as to be an initiate, and that when they live honestly with themselves, they are far closer to the light than when they put on long robes, chant mantras, and act like a lot of 10-year-old children on Halloween. They are disgracing the very thing which they should be defending as above human comparison. The greatest insult that the average man can heap upon occult science is to claim to understand it, and least of all to represent it. When Mr. Gothenburg claims to be an initiate, while his relatives and friends know positively that he has not taken a bath in 5 years, that he chews tobacco, is seldom sober, and is eternally mixed up in domestic problems, and several similar things, he is not glorifying himself by his claims, but is simply making a joke out of the thing he claims to be, and is literally, if not intentionally, advertising the fact to the world that intemperance is the path to mastery, and that being a sot is necessary to immortality. The whole thing is a joke, but it is a very crude one, a blasphemous one. And the average self-ordained initiate is a living lie, both to himself and the great doctrines which he claims to represent. Those who claim nothing do not have to live up to anything in order to be true to their claims. But when they stand before the world as examples of finished products, what happens to our scintillating Royal Dresden initiate? Their faults show all the more because they claim to be without them, and they are all the more ridiculous because of their scanctimonious hypocrisy. It is only one person's opinion, of course, but we admit freely we do not have much use for them. When we see our leading initiates concentrating upon nice, juicy beefsteaks or surrounded by cigarette stubs, we are convinced of one of two things. Either that occultism is a joke, or else they are. We prefer to think it is the latter. We do not say necessarily that they should live any better. That is their problem. But this we do say. If they do not intend to live any better, they have no right to claim to be that which they obviously are not, and in this way bring reflection against a noble cause. We are very fond of retiring initiates who obliterate their presence in bashful reticence, but when they come out with brass bands and a torchlight parade, we are inclined to be a little skeptical. When the world applauds them, we are quite confident that they are no good, but when they applaud themselves, we gird up our garments and depart, for such is not done in the better regulated circles. There may be 1 or 2 initiates out of the thousands who claim to be, but we doubt even that percentage. The real initiates will always be found to be men and women without claims, and we have no knowledge of the fact that they ever bestowed a degree upon anyone. The average worker in occult lines is only expressing an opinion, and he does not know whether that opinion is so or not. It is his privilege to express that opinion, but it is not his privilege to use the name of the initiates for the furtherance of said opinion. Such action is forgery. The masters do not retaliate to these insults. They remain silent and unknown, in this way proving their mastery, while the pseudo-initiates spend all their time accepting glory. The true teachers are willing that they should receive it, but must smile to themselves when they see the self-conceited egotists accepting the laurels of another man's work. Occult fiction. The Chair of Doom. It was in the summer palace of the emperor, where cherry blossoms filled the air, little bridges led across waterways filled with fishes of gold and silver, and little dwarfed fir trees scarce higher than your waist edged the row and parked lawns of the summer garden. In the midst of this beauty was a little pagoda, where the emperor used to come and sit, and in it was a glorious chair of carved ebony, its black cut to resemble an ancient tree, through which flew ho-ho birds with little eyes of gleaming mother of pearl. The emperor used to love to come here and sit in the midst of his summer garden to laugh and smile with nature. But as the years went by and the step of the emperor grew halt, the cares of state resting heavily upon him, he came less often to his chair in the garden. One who was close to him and beloved of him came to the emperor one day and said, "Sire, you have been sad these many days, but the sun shines in the sky and the garden is in bloom. Come out once more to the pagoda of dreams as you used to do in the days gone by." The emperor was silent, for his mind went back over the years beyond recall, and he dreamed of the hours he had spent in his garden of cherry blossoms. Then, leaning on his arm of this one whom he trusted, he went into his garden, where he had not walked for many years. And there, with but few to attend him or to break the solitude of his thoughts, he sank as a weary pilgrim into his chair in the garden. For years, none had sat there. The chair was dusty and streaked with age, and the glinty eyes of the ho-ho birds had fallen out. But the emperor did not care, for in the hours he sat upon it he lived in the long ago, in the days when in youth and carelessness he had lived in his garden of dreams. Still the same chrysanthemums raised their many-colored heads and danced in the sun. Still the golden fishes leaped in the pools, and the white storks with their crimson crests balanced in silent majesty in the watery rills. He heard the same waterfall which had sounded in his ears when he had played his love song in the gardens years before. And the emperor was sad, sad with the remembrance of loves and joys lost forever. So he sat in his chair, moody and silent, while the glorious sun sank down in the endless west as his own life was fast sinking in the endless west of eternity. And in this way the emperor fell asleep in his garden of cherry blossoms, and there he slept forever. When dawn came, they found the spirit gone and the body asleep in the pagoda of dreams. The years went by, and another king sat upon the throne, but none would enter the garden, for it was there the emperor had gone to sleep. So a story came down through the ages that told of the chair of endless sleep in the pagoda of golden dreams. It was warned that whoever went into the garden of pleasure would sometime go back again and enter the rest eternal in the garden of their dreams. So the new king never went there for fear that he too would fall asleep in the enchanted chair. He had a mighty wall built around the garden, that none might enter, for he had been told by a reader of the stars that he would go to sleep as his father had in his pagoda of dreams. So he issued orders to all the world that none should go into that garden, and none should ever speak to him of that garden, for he vowed in his soul to live forever as a ruler of his people. Thus, for 100 years, the old chair stood alone in the garden of wild cherry blossoms, and the old king swore a new oath every year to outlive the curse. Now it seems that there came into this land the foot of the white man, coming as it so often did, not to lift, but to rob, not to serve, but to pillage. One of these white men learned of the pagoda of dreams, and the sacred chair that was in it. One night, when all was still, he climbed over the high old wall to steal this treasure. Passing through the darkness of the night, amid the little arches and bridges and altars of granite, he finally came to rest at the gate of the pagoda of dreams. The hinges were rusty and old. The golden lattice work was tarnished and broken. The lanterns that had lighted the garden were but skeletons of wood, from which the gay silks had long since rotted. The little fish no longer played in the stream, for it was dried and their bones were mixed with the sand. The chrysanthemum beds were filled with weeds, and the palms were overgrown with bushes, for none had entered it since the day the emperor had died. The American, with his hand on the hilt of a revolver, broke the lock of the pagoda door and passed it where the pale rays of the moon but dimly entered through the gaping holes of a decaying roof. There, in the center of an inlaid floor, stood the chair of doom. It was a broken thing that had once been the resting place of an emperor, and overgrown with a tangle of weeds and cobwebs where spiders had built their nests in its carvings. The American stood for several seconds viewing this broken chair, dreaming of the fortune it would bring in the Western world when they knew of its secret history. As he stood there in the night, he heard a footfall behind him. Turning, he saw coming towards him an Oriental robed in a wonderful garment of embroidered chrysanthemums and lotus flowers. This figure walked slowly forward with his hands outstretched before him. The American looked fixedly at his face and saw that his eyes were closed. "What can it mean?" he muttered, creeping back into the shadow. The robed man walked up to the battered gate and then slowly round and round the pagoda in the same measured tread, with eyes closed and hands extended. At last the truth flashed into the mind of the American. The figure was that of the ancient emperor, and he was walking in his sleep. The ideas and thoughts of his life had become so fixed in his mind with the dread of the chair of gloom that night after night, when his body was in resistless sleep, an unknown and unnameable force drew him into the garden of the pagoda of dreams, amid the scent of the cherry blossoms. Slowly the Oriental entered the pagoda and seated himself, eyes still closed, in the chair of doom from which none might rise. As he sat there, the American started in surprise. Across the floor of the pagoda, a strange creature was crawling, its hard shell-like claws grating on the stone. He stood as though fascinated and watched while a gigantic scorpion, like a small crab or lobster, crept slowly towards the seated figure of the sleeping emperor. With his eyes fixed upon the insect, the American stood as if spellbound, as the thing climbed up the robes of the Oriental as he sat sleeping in the chair. The moon glided for a second behind a great wall of clouds that had risen from the valley and hung like a shade around the crest of the distant mountains. When it passed from behind the clouds and shed its cold beams again into the pagoda of dreams, a strange sight was revealed. The emperor lay in the chair where his father had died, and on the ground beside him, the crushed body of the scorpion. Over the two stood the American, who gazed in astonishment as the light came on. Seeing the dead insect, he shook the quiet form. The body swayed as he shook it, and would have fallen from the chair had he not drawn it back. Then, as he looked more closely, he saw on the back of the dead hand 2 tiny marks, like a pair of lips, where the kiss of the scorpion had fulfilled the ancient prophecy. "So," murmured the American, "that is the chair of doom. Well, I'll leave it forever where it stands in the orchard of cherry blossoms. Twice it has fulfilled its pledge." And slowly he passed out from the pagoda, and to where the great wall surrounded all. Suddenly a figure appeared from the darkness. A long, thin, hollowed tube was placed to its lips. Then through the night, a shaft of tufted steel shot from the mouth of a blowgun. The American turned, swayed for a second, and slowly crumpled at the foot of the wall just a few feet from the pagoda. When morning came, they found the emperor asleep in the chair of doom, and by the wall the body of a foreigner, and his back a poisoned dart. A new law was passed in that land, and a great crew was turned into the garden. For many days and nights they labored to destroy a superstition. They tore up the bridges and the shrines, filled the stream beds with dirt. They burned the pagoda, and with it the chair of doom. And now another world stands in that garden of dreams, a wonderful building of brick and stone with an elevator running up and down. The busy purr of an east, awakened by the hand of the west, stands where once the cherry blossoms swayed. The legend of the chair of doom is nearly forgotten, but hidden away in the records of a mysterious people is the old story of the pagoda of golden dreams in the enchanted garden of the emperor. Human interest stories. The Man Who Laughed. In sunny Sicily, beneath the towering height of Mount Etna, under whose mystic pile, so legend tells, the Vulcans hammer out the weapons of Jove on the anvil of the gods, there lies a little village. Sicily is dotted with many lovely little hamlets, looking like bright nosegays set in frames of green and brown. One of these little villages nestles close in the arms of Etna, and many of its buildings reflect the whims of the volcano. Far above it, a little dot on the mountain, one can see the great observatory, and below rolls the blue waters of the Mediterranean. A picturesque little town it is, just as the mind of the dreamer loves to create, and as, in imagination, the homely old-fashioned peasant life is still lived. On a wall built from the rocks of the flaming mountain sat a native guide who looked not unlike a brigand, and he was dressed in accordance with his personality. His ears were pierced, and in them hung heavy golden rings. His hair was controlled within the bonds of a red bandana handkerchief. His ears were pierced, and in them hung heavy golden rings. His hair was controlled within the bonds of a red bandana handkerchief, and his drooping black mustache was carefully and fiercely combed, adding a swagger note to his eccentric figure. Beside him stood George Washington. By way of explanation, we may add that George W. was a long-eared, tired-looking Sicilian donkey who would always lie down when you wanted him to stand up, and stand up when you wanted him to lie down. Washington and his master were part of the natural scenery of the village, and strangers passing through on their ride around the island were shown the village church, the cave of the saints nearby, and George Washington. Leonardo, the guide, had a peculiar distinction. He spoke the best English for miles around, and therefore was always watching for an opportunity to commercialize his intelligence. At the time our story opens, he had Henry Thornton at his mercy. Thornton was a man with a past. Not the kind that men are ashamed of, but the kind that some men are broken by. It is said that the world is filled with heartless men, but this is not essentially the case. And careful investigation will prove that the heart of man breaks just as easily as the heart of a woman. But a man hides it more carefully and receives little sympathy for the ache that the world does not see. Thornton was one of those men who could neither conceal nor forget, and he carried his sorrow with him wherever he went. His mind was always obsessed with one thought, and he lived entirely in the years that were past. The tale of woe of this man was a long one, and also an old one. It fills the lives of thousands all over the world, for there are none who can hurt as much as those we love and trust. It was simply the story of one who cared and another who simply played, and with the carelessness of a child broke a human heart. That was years ago, in the days of lace and lavender, and the thoughtless one had lain asleep these many years in a little village cemetery. All the world had forgotten save one. All the world had forgiven save one. But even as the gray shadows began to fall on the life of Henry Thornton, he remembered. His handsome face would cloud and his jaw set tighter as he vainly sought for something upon which to wreak his venom. A poison long brewing in a heart that hated happiness because it was not happy too. As Thornton stood beside that guide, leaning over the old wall, his eyes fell upon a little garden some 20 feet below. A pretty little place filled with rustic chairs and tables where the townfolk came to sup and their sour wine and tell the stories of their day. It was deserted, save for a few children playing in a corner, and one figure that sat huddled in a brown robe at one of the tables. The children were playing some strange game, and every few minutes they would tumble over each other in a mad whirl of bare arms and legs, and the Sicilian dust rose in a cloud about the scene. The figure at the table raised his head, and a long peal of deep-throated laughter sounded up to the two men above. Thornton's face had been composed, but as this merry sound broke upon his ears, his jaw set, his eyes became slits, and he hissed out 3 words with all the bile of years of acidity. "Damn that man." The guide looked at the American in amazement and then followed his eyes to the little scene below. He quickly crossed himself, but made no audible reply, although he murmured something under his breath. Thornton continued to gaze at the little group, and then, feeling that he must make a confidant of someone, he turned to Leonardo. "Come, sit down on this wall. I want to tell you something. I will explain my attitude, for it must seem very strange to you." "Si, signor," answered the guide, and with a look to his mule he seated himself upon the wall, perfectly willing to let the American talk as long as his pay went on. Thornton took out the cigarette case and gave the Italian a smoke. Then, closing the case, sat gazing at it for several seconds, and then turned it so the guide could see the little oil-painted miniature, beautifully done by some master's hand upon an inlay of purest ivory. The Sicilian looked at the face for several seconds, and then, raising his eyes and opening his hands, he muttered, "She is a beautiful face." "Yes, she was beautiful in the days gone by," answered Thornton, staring out into the distant haze that hung over the Mediterranean. "Beautiful, but thoughtless. She played with hearts as children played with dolls, and mine was broken in the game. That was nearly 40 years ago in America's sunny Southland, where beauty is nature's order and gallantry her decree. Oh God, that I could forget like others do, but I cannot. I have gone from one end of the earth to the other, but ever that face haunts me. I've never laughed since the day, unless it was in a mad delirium. I've taken the path of forgetfulness, but there is no peace. In the opium smoke she haunts me. In the drink she dances in my wineglass, breaking my heart again and again as she did that day. My hair turned white in just a few short months, and I have lived in sorrow and sadness these many years. That is why I hate to see people happy. Why should they be so when I am not? Did God send me into this world to wander my life in agony? When I see these children playing in happiness and I hear the glad laughter, I go insane to think of the years of loneliness I've come through, how I might have listened to the laughter of my own children, and in my own age been peaceful in the realization of life's dream. That, sir, is why I hate people that laugh and revile the God who gave me the heart to love and then doomed it to be broken. Bah! There he laughing again. Oh, damn that man! I shall go mad if he does not stop. I would give all I own to be he this day, just so that I could laugh. Surely, signor, you are jesting. You do not mean to say that you would like to change places with Fra Angelico, the old man who sits down there at the table. Surely you jest. No, Leonardo, I am deadly earnest. I would give all I own if I could laugh as he laughs today. Signor, you have told me a story. Now let me tell you one. The story of the old man who sits there at the table, laughing at the children who play around his feet. May I tell it to you? Yes, go ahead. I do not care when I get back to the hotel. I would not be sorry if I never did. All right, signor, I shall proceed. It was, let me see, and the Sicilian counted on his fingers, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yes, 6 years ago that Antonio had his little market in Adorno. He had a beautiful little farm up on the side of Etna. You see where that black streak is? Well, Antonio's farm was just a little to the right of that heap of boulders. Signor, that was in the year of the eruption. Down the sides of our mountain the lava came in a great fiery stream, and Antonio was in the marketplace at the time. Like a madman he rushed home, but when he got there all he saw was a great fissure in the earth with sulfur fumes rising from its depths. All in a few seconds. His wife, whom he adored, his mother, whom he worshipped, and his 5 little children, whom he cherished more than life itself, were swallowed up by the flaming mountain. Well, Signor, we saw little of Antonio for many months. He wandered like a madman among the hills, and even the brigands grew afraid of him. He climbed among the rocks, wild-eyed and crazy. But at last he grew quiet again, and feeling that he had nothing left to live for, he climbed up yonder hill to the little monastery. There he took holy orders and gave his life to the service of Christ and the Blessed Virgin. Antonio vanished from the world, and there appeared in his place Fra Angelico, who has lived ever since to try and help others. "Did he really go through all that?" asked Thornton in amazement. "Si, signor, and much more in his heart that no man shall ever know." "And yet he can laugh. Oh, how I envy such a man as that. Why did God give him courage to laugh, and me only the weakness to cry?" "Leonardo, I am more jealous of that man than of any other living thing in the universe. I would give anything to be as happy." "Surely, signor, you do not mean that. You are not jealous of poor Fra Angelico." "Yes, I am jealous of him. He is able to laugh and forget." "He cannot help laughing, signor, nor can he help forgetting. The good God has taken his mind away from him. The poor father has been mad these many years. Surely you are not jealous of a babbling idiot, nor would you curse a man whose sorrow has taken away his mind. In this world, signor, it is well to be careful whom we envy, for those who laugh often are sadder than those who cry." Special Articles. The Wine of Life. Near the close of the 11th century at Nashapur in Khorasan, there lived a poet-philosopher, Omar Khayyam. Little is known of his private life and history, but today the verses of Omar, called the Rubaiyat, live as they have never lived before. He was the first great writer of Persia and has been read and studied through all these hundreds of years in his native land. But it does seem like a strange twisting of fate that he should be so alive in this ultra-modern world of ours, and that his piquant old-world philosophy should rise so true today. However, there is probably no more widely misunderstood writer in all the annals of literature than Omar, for the peculiar phraseology of his work is very deceiving, and his meaning is usually directly contrary to the statement made. But a careful analysis of his writing will show the observant thinker that in every case there is a deep underlying meaning that bespeaks of great philosophical understanding. Nor did his genius stop at verse-making, for he was the foremost mathematician and scientific astronomer of his day, and much of the calendar system we use now was brought to its present state by his efforts. And it does not seem fitting that one who so lived the life of a sage and mystic should have written light and meaningless things. But that is the way of the world. They only see with the eyes they have. It is just the same with our Bible. The historians read it as history. The imaginative read it as romance. The astrologers read it as astrology. The alchemists read it as alchemical. And the materialists, well, to them all the spiritual scripture of the world is just so much useless tommyrot. Consequently, they condemn, destroy, and paint darkly everything of such nature with which they come in contact. And that is just why most of the ancient books of religious nature were written as they were, in allegory, hidden from the eyes of those who were not ready to know. Reading the following verses of the Rubaiyat through the eyes of the rank materialists, what have we? Waste not your hour, nor in the vain pursuit of this and that endeavor and dispute. Better be jocund with the fruitful grape than sadden after none or bitter fruit. For is and is not, though with rule and line and up and down by logic I define, Of all that one should care to fathom, I was never deep in anything but wine. Come, fill the cup, and in the fire of spring your winter garment of repentance fling. The bird of time has but a little way to flutter, and the bird is on the wing. Just the rambling fantasies of a drunkard. Nothing more nor less than beautiful poetry about drink and intoxication. And that is what the average individual sees. Others say, no, there's something deeper behind it, and so lay it aside. They are willing to believe that it is inspired, perhaps, but how and why or what it really means is nothing at all to them. However, it is a known fact that Omar talked a great deal more of his wine than he drank of it. And though his entire philosophy is centered around the brimming cup, he means something else. The Rubaiyat is a conversation or soliloquy delivered by the human soul to its divine spirit, referring to the body as the clay cup, in some instances as the loaf of bread, and to the life in man as the red wine. Here, with a loaf of bread beneath the bough, a flask of wine, a book of verse, and thou, beside me singing in the wilderness, and wilderness is paradise enow. For thousands of years, the juice of the grape has been used to represent the life essence in man because it is the closest thing in nature to human blood, and it contains the sun's vitalizing rays in a greater amount than anything else, for the sun is the base of its fermentation. As the human brain, with its many convolutions, resembles a bunch of grapes, it is called the bough or grape. While this essence or spiritual life of man is in the brain centers and is therefore the juice of the grape. And so Omar says that the wine of life is all there is and all else is a lie. Speaking of his search for some other thing worthwhile and the uselessness of it all, he says, myself, when young, did eagerly frequent doctor and saint, and heard great argument about it and about, but evermore came out by the same door where I went in. Why, all the saints and sages who discussed of the two worlds so learnedly are thrust, like foolish prophets forth, their words to scorn, are scattered, and their mouths are stopped with dust. And who has not heard, as he did, the saints and sages discussing? We have a number of them right in this city. They gather on the street corners and in the halls, shouting in all directions. One will say, ectoplasm is the base of all things. Another will answer, no, it is protoplasm. Then, you fool, it is ectoplasm. And they rip and rant and roar. It was this that Omar enjoyed, and said of them, they are foolish prophets, and in the end their mouths are stopped with dust. And it is true, for that is the end of all. The ranters and roarers die hard, but there is only one ending. Death stops all. And so Omar preferred not to speculate upon the beginning nor the hereafter. He deals not with where we came from, where we are going and why, but only with what we are doing today. His sentiments are, if I do that which is good today, tomorrow will take care of itself. If I made a mistake yesterday, it does no good to worry about it now. Strange is it not that the myriads who before us passed the door of darkness, though not one returns to tell us of the road which to discover we must travel too. Alike for those who for today prepare, and those that after some tomorrow stare. The muezzin from the tower of darkness cries, fools, your reward is neither here nor there. Ah, my beloved, fill the cup that clears today of past regret and future fears. Tomorrow, why tomorrow? I may myself with yesterday's 7,000 years. Ah, make the most of what we may spend, before we too into the dust descend. Dust into dust, and under dust to lie, sans wine, sans song, sans singer, and sans end. And of the hopelessness of human destiny he speaks, into this universe, and why not knowing, nor whence, like water willy-nilly flowing, and out of it as wind along the waste, I know not whither, willy-nilly blowing. What, without asking, hither hurried whence, and without asking, whither hurried hence? Oh, many a cup of this forbidden wine must drown the memory of that insolence. Up from earth's centre through the seventh gate I rose, and on the throne of Saturn sate, and many a knot unravelled by the road, but not the master knot of human fate. There was a door to which I found no key, there was the veil through which I could not see. Some little talk of me and thee there was, and then no more of thee and me. Earth could not answer, nor the seas that mourn in flowing purple of their Lord forlorn, nor rolling heaven with all his signs revealed and hidden by the sleeve of night and morn. Omar realized that all living things are pieces on a great game board, all moved by a mystic player in the way that they should go. This mysterious player is the spirit of man, and the checkerboard is life, and the pieces on the board are the living problems which confront us. And we are the mystery of every game we play. But most of us get so wrapped up in our game that we become enslaved to our own selves, instead of being masters of the chessboard. We are no other than a moving row of magic shadow shapes that come and go, round with this sun-illumined lantern held in midnight by the master of the show, impotent pieces of the game he plays upon this checkerboard of nights and days. Hither and thither moves and checks and slays, and one by one in the closet lays. The ball no question makes of A's and no's, but right and left as strikes the player goes. And he that tossed you down into the field, he knows about it all, he knows. The moving finger writes, and having writ moves on, nor all your piety nor wit shall lure it back to cancel half a line, nor all your tears wash out a word of it. And that inverted bowl they call the sky, where under crawling cooped we live and die, lift not your hands to it for help, for it as impotently rolls as you or I. And as though to lessen or counteract the utter hopelessness of this, he brings the power of human individuality to bear. I sent my soul through the invisible some letter of that afterlife to spell, and by my soul returned to me, and answered, I myself and heaven and hell. Heaven but the vision of fulfilled desire, and hell but the shadow of a soul on fire, cast on the darkness into which ourselves so late emerged from shall soon so expire. And then of the responsibility of the soul, perhaps a hint of reincarnation, he writes the following and gives the urge to live in today and drink the ever-present wine of life. Yesterday this day's madness did prepare, tomorrow's silence, triumph or despair. Drink, for you know whence you came. Drink, for you know not why you go, nor where. And so the entire philosophy of the Rubaiyat twines around the vine of life, and the key to the whole is in learning how to drink this mystic wine. When man lives properly and is vitalized by his life, the food he eats and the sun he absorbs, he gathers into his being a spiritual essence, extracting it from all the base elements that constitute his bodies. And this essence of life is the basis of all energy, and the whole secret of this mystic wine is in the conservation of energy and its expression through creative channels. Wherever energy is used, it should produce something equal to the amount expended. And if man would only realize this, he would be less likely to waste the precious motive power of life in riotous living, for he would know that when he expends it constructively, he would gain constructively, and when he uses it destructively, he loses twice as much. A person who gets violently angry and cannot restrain himself is intoxicated with this life energy, and the essence is fermented through perversion. It is when this energy is turned upward into the brain that it becomes creative, and when turned downward into the generative system in perversion that it becomes destructive. When this subtle substance, the wine of life, vitalizes the brain and all the energies are turned into the upper room, the man truly drinks of the fruit of the vine and partakes of the substances he has transmuted. And Omar says if you are living on this fruit of the vine, you have secured all this world has to give, symbolizing the great life-giving qualities of the wine. The grape that can with logic absolute the 2 and 70 jarring sects confute, the sovereign alchemist that in a trice life's leaden metal into gold transmute. Why be this juice the growth of God who dare blaspheme the twisted tendril as a snare? A blessing we should use it, should we not? And if a curse, why then, who set it there? I must abjure the balm of life, I must, scared by some after-reckoning, tan on trust, or lured with hope of some diviner drink to fill the cup when crumbled into dust. O threats of hell and hopes of paradise, one thing at least is certain, this life flies. One thing is certain, and the rest is lies. The flower that once has blown forever dies. And so this transmutation of the life energies is the greatest alchemical mystery the world has ever known. If the cup be empty, there is no philosophy, and the argument of sage and seer means nothing. The path that the individual walks through years and lives of experience, the growth, the gains by practical labor, mental, spiritual, and physical, are the basis of the wisdom teachings. And there is no other way. Omar says that life is wine poured into a jug, and that a broken jug is of no use to anyone, for there is nothing in it. And we have with us and all around those broken jugs, walking about with nothing in them but ashes. Inside they are cremated by the fires of desire, hate and fear, and the flames of passion burned out. The vine is dead, and all that remains is just an urn filled with ashes. And so, if you will read Omar Khayyam's beautiful verses, taking the human soul as the vine, the bread as the bodies, the wine as the blood or life-giver, and Omar as the spirit, you will find something very useful. The bunch of grapes as the brain has been the symbol of life for ages, for in it is contained the life forces which make possible every expression of energy man has. And mastery and initiation is the complete control of it and the turning of it into the development of the spiritual organism. It is suffering, sorrow, philosophy, art, science, and the study which gradually attain to that end. But the greatest means known to man are purification and balance. Purification of life and motive turns this energy from all destructive application, and the absolute poise of mastery prevents its expansion into useless pursuits. All depends upon the individual. When he lives the life, he shall know the doctrine. There are many, many more wonderful and deeply mystic truths brought out in this beautiful classic, and in this article we have only touched a few of them lightly. While the lack of space prevents going into verse by verse and giving it the interpretation it deserves, still this brief summary will give some idea of the great import of this deeply religious poem. The whole work is based upon the knowledge of man's duty to the life forces within him, and death means that this energy is gone, and therefore Omar says that whoever has inverted the cup is dead, and so ends the poem with these verses. Yon rising moon that looks for us again, how oft hereafter will she wax and wane? How oft hereafter, rising look for us through this same garden, and for one in vain. And when like her, O Saki, you will pass among the guests stars scattered on the grass, and in your blissful errand reached the spot where I made one turn down an empty glass. Special Articles. A Key to Physic and Occult Sciences. In last month's issue, we reprinted from an old edition an excerpt from Culpeper's famous Old Family Herbal. This was the first of a series of articles we are going to run each month, reprinted from the rare first editions of the 15th, 16th, and 17th century books on the sacred sciences, for the benefit of those who cannot obtain these volumes. The following article is taken from Dr. Sibley's Key to Physic and the Occult Sciences. Wisdom is the light of reason and the bond of peace. It affiliates man with God and elevates his mind above unworthy pursuits. It is the principal excellence which distinguishes him from brutes, and the chief ornament that dignifies his character. Whatever's founded in wisdom's laws defies the moldering hand of time and ranks with immortality. Hence it is that a thirst after knowledge is natural to man, and if the cares and follies of this world could be estranged from his concerns, his desire of information would be inseparable from his existence. Ignorance and superstition may be considered as the curse of God, which chains its votaries to unworthy objects, whilst, on the contrary, wisdom and understanding provide us with wings whereby to soar above the earth, to contemplate the works of creation, to discern the mysteries of divinity and converse with angels. The beautiful description given by Solomon of his acquirements in wisdom is highly deserving the attention of all men, but particularly of those who profess the science of physic and the cure of souls. "I prayed," says Solomon, "and understanding was given me. I called upon God, and the spirit of wisdom came to me. All good things came with her, and innumerable riches in her hand." What greater reward could anyone desire? And though the intellectual faculties of all men are not alike strong and apt for occult speculations, yet it is manifest that all persons are capable of deriving great improvements from reading, and that it is not so much the want of natural ability as of industry and application that so many men disgrace the image of the deity, and degrade the venerable professions of divinity, physic, and law. It rarely happens that the want of intellect or natural endowments of the mind are the rocks on which man split in their professional character. Indocile and unapt indeed must that man be whom education, experience, observations, reading, or inquiry will not set generally right in his progress through life. Yet, without industry and an anxious desire of knowledge and improvement, neither education nor all the advantages of natural ability can save us from the wreck of error or the disgrace of ignorance. Obstinate men, though of the first capacity in the world, are a forlorn hope and often irrecoverably lost, by unadvisedly pursuing the phantom of their own brain, whilst others, enriched by dignity of sense and qualified by depth of understanding, so form the brightest characters amongst society, surrender up their talents for discernment and inquiry, and content themselves with taking upon trust whatever they see or hear, particularly in the practice of physic, in the law, and in the church. The mischiefs attendant on this general conduct of mankind are great and many, for by thus implicitly subscribing to the vague notions and false doctrines of others, by shutting their eyes against the light of reason and inquiry and refusing to receive the conviction of their own senses, they transfer error from one generation to another until the unlettered multitude, dazzled by the splendid ignorance of the learned few, become disciples to their mistakes and make error and enthusiasm an hereditary disease. Hence, then, we see the necessity of consulting our own reason and employing our own understanding in the discrimination of all our temporal and eternal affairs, and of acting and judging for ourselves on all occasions which immediately regard our health, our happiness, or our life, and under all those afflictions and misfortunes wherewith we struggle in this world, in our passage to a better, to one more glorious and permanent, the ultimate end and reward of all our labors. Our senses on these occasions are ever ready to support our endeavors and perform their office, and it is unquestionably the duty of all men to exercise, to improve, and employ them. Yet it is astonishing in general to see how distrustful we are of those very faculties nature has given us for our guide, and how fondly we submit to the opinions of others, whose nerves cannot feel for us, and whose judgment is often founded upon erroneous principle, and sometimes on no principles at all. This, however, is a conduct by no means fitted to the dignity and office assigned to men, who, being placed at the head of all God's works upon earth, walking in his image and exercising dominion over his creatures, is bound to improve that intellect of reason and understanding, whereby he is to govern and direct them according to the dictates of truth, of justice, and of mercy. For this purpose he ought, like Solomon, to study the occult properties and qualities of all things, from the cedar tree that is in Lebanon, even unto the hyssop that springeth out of the wall, with whatever relates to a proper knowledge of himself, and of beasts, and of fowls, and of creeping things, and of fishes. Not to worship the sun, nor the moon, nor the stars, nor any of the host of heaven, but to consider, to admire, and to investigate their characters, fixed by the hand of God for signs, for seasons, and for days and years. They, in fact, contain no more than what every man ought to be acquainted with, to the best of his abilities, because they lead to a comprehensive idea of those occult causes and effects which act the most, though they are the least seen, and whereby the human understanding is enlightened and improved, and the mind enriched with those divine precepts, which lead to a manifestation of that first and omnipotent cause, to whose power all second causes are subservient, and operate but as the agents of his will, and under whose provident care and sufferance we see, feel, move, speak, and have our being. The 10,000 blessings which result from this study are found in our inquiries after truth, and the mysteries which surround us, of the astonishing sympathy and antipathy betwixt heavenly and earthly substances, of the wonderful harmony and construction of the celestial bodies, of the nature and qualities of our own existence, and the propagation of our own species, of the occult properties implanted in all created beings, and the end for which they are and were created. To such inquiries all men are alike competent, and may boast the same pretensions, unless obstinacy or indolence are substituted to prevent them. There is certainly implanted in the human mind a power which perceives truth and commands belief in all the occult properties of nature, not by the force of argument, nor learning, nor science, but by an instantaneous, instinctive, and irresistible impulse, derived neither from education nor from habit, but from the peculiar gift of providence, acting independently of our will whenever these objects are presented, bearing evidence of their reality, even when the pride of our external deportment and our very words affect to deny them. This is an intellectual sensation, which I will venture to affirm is felt more or less by all mankind. And I know the hearts of all my readers, if not their tongues, will admit the fact. It is therefore evident that the humble cottager, the classical curate, the regular physician, and the village doctor stand on the same level in this respect. The study of nature's laws, of the occult properties in medicine, and in the frame and temperature of our bodies is no less simple than important to our welfare. And without knowing these, we know nothing that can place us beyond the sagacity of the brute creation. We can neither foresee danger nor shun it when it is near. We are subject to misguided treatment and mistake in our medical applications and advice. We receive intuitive signs and tokens of misfortune or advantage without knowing how to benefit by the admonition. In short, without this study, our inquiries are vain, our perceptions are clouded, our views limited, and all our pursuits are vanity, vexation, and disappointment. The weakness of our reason and the avocations arising from the infirmities and necessities of our situations require the most powerful instructions and the clearest perceptions of heavenly and earthly things for the preservation of our souls and bodies, and for the illumination of our minds, advantages that can in no wise be more completely obtained than by an intimate acquaintance with the occult sciences, or, in other words, by a contemplation of God and nature. Though God has given us no innate ideas of himself, yet having furnished us with those faculties our minds are endowed with, he hath not left himself without a witness. Since we have sense, perception, and reason, and cannot but want a clear proof of him, as long as we carry any thought of ourselves about us, To show, therefore, that we are capable of knowing, that is, being certain that there is a God, and how we may come by this certainty, I think we need go no further than ourselves, and that undoubted knowledge we have of our own existence. I think it is beyond question that man has a clear perception of his own being. He knows certainly that he exists, and that he is something. In the next place, man knows by an intuitive certainty that bare nothing can no more produce any real being than it can be equal to two right angles. If therefore we know that there is some real being, it is an evident demonstration that from eternity there has been something. Since what was not from eternity had a beginning, and what had a beginning must be produced by something else. Next, it is evident that what has its being from another must also have all that which is in it, and belongs to its being from another too. All the powers it has must be owing to and received from the same source. This eternal source of all being must be also the source and original of all power. And so this eternal being must be also the most powerful. Again, man finds in himself perception and knowledge. We are certain, then, that there is not only some being, but some knowing, intelligent being in the world. There was a time when there was no knowing being, or else there has been a knowing being from eternity. If it be said there was a time when that eternal being had no knowledge, I reply, then, that it is impossible there should have ever been any knowledge, it being as impossible that things wholly void of knowledge and operating blindly and without any perception should produce a knowing being, as it is impossible that a triangle should make itself 3 angles bigger than 2 right ones. Thus, from the consideration of ourselves and what we infallibly find in our own constitutions, our reason leads us to the knowledge of this certain and evident truth, that there is an eternal, most powerful and knowing being, which whether anyone will call God, it matters not. The thing is evident, and from this idea, duly considered, will easily be deduced all those other attributes we ought to ascribe to this eternal being. From what has been said, it is plain that we have a more certain knowledge of the existence of a God than of anything our senses have not immediately discovered to us. Nay, I presume I may say that we more certainly know that there is a God than that there is anything else without us. When I say we know, mean there is such a knowledge within our reach, which we cannot miss, if we will but apply our minds to that as we do to other inquiries. It being then unavoidable for all rational creatures to conclude that something has existed from eternity. Let us next see what kind of thing that must be. There are but 2 sorts of beings in the world that man knows or conceives, such as are purely material, without sense or perception, and sensible, perceiving beings such as we find ourselves to be. These 2 sorts we shall call cogitative and incogitative beings, which to our present purpose are better than material and immaterial. If then there must be something eternal, it is very obvious to reason that it must necessarily be a cogitative being, because it is as impossible to conceive that bare incogitative matter could ever produce a thinking, intelligent being, as that nothing of itself should produce matter. Let us suppose any parcel or matter eternal, we shall find it in itself unable to produce anything. Let us suppose its parts firmly at rest together. If there were no other being in the world, must it not eternally remain so, a dead, unactive lump? Is it possible to conceive that it can add motion to itself or produce anything? Matter, then, by its own strength, cannot produce in itself so much as motion. The motion it has must also be from eternity, or else added to matter by some other being more powerful than matter. But let us suppose motion eternal too. Yet matter, incogitative matter, and motion could never produce thought. Knowledge will still be as far beyond the power of nothing to produce. Divide matter into as minute parts as you will, vary its figure and motion as much as you please, it will operate no otherwise upon other bodies of proportionable bulk than it did before the division. The minutest particles of matter knock, repel, and resist one another, just as the greater do. And that is all they can do. So that if we suppose nothing eternal, matter can never begin to be. If we suppose bare matter without motion eternal, thought can never begin to be. For it is impossible to conceive that matter, either with or without motion, could have originally in and from itself sense, perception, and knowledge, as is evident from hence. That then sense, perception, and knowledge must be a property eternally inseparable from matter, and every particle of it. Since, therefore, whatsoever is the first eternal being must necessarily be cogitative, and whatsoever is first of all things must necessarily contain in it and actually have at least all the perfections that can ever after exist, it necessarily follows that the first eternal being cannot be matter. The discovery of the necessary existence of an eternal mind sufficiently leads us to the knowledge of God. For it will hence follow that all other knowing beings that have a beginning must depend upon him, and have no other ways of knowledge or extent of power than what he gives them. And therefore, if he made those, he made also the less excellent pieces of this universe, all inanimate bodies, whereby his omniscience, power, and providence will be established. And from thence all his other attributes necessarily follow. Thus, a manifestation of the deity is visible in all his work. There is not the smallest part of that immense space our eyes behold, or our imagination conceives, that is not filled with his presence. The worlds which revolve with so much order, beauty, and harmony, to the immensity of space, the sun, moon, stars, and planets, are upheld by the light of his countenance, but for which they would drop from their orbs and plunged into the vast abyss, would return to their primitive chaos. To the mercy of God we owe all the blessings of his life, as the reward of good and virtuous actions. To his anger we justly attribute all violent concussions of the elements, famine, plague, pestilence, etc., brought on a wicked and abandoned people, like the storm of the fire and brimstone on Sodom and Gomorrah. The vengeance of the deity cannot be more awfully described than by David in his Psalms, which should act as a timely warning to those atheists and unbelievers and to those wicked, idolatrous, and polluted countries, against whose detestable crimes these terrible scourges have been so often sent. The shaking of the earth, the trembling of the hills and mountains, the flames of devouring fire darting through the firmament, the heavens bending down with the forked thunderbolts, their riding on the clouds and flying on the wings of a whirlwind, the bursting of the lightnings from the horrid darkness, the tremendous peals of thunder, the storms of fiery hail, the melting of the heavens, and dissolving into floods of the tempestuous rains, the earth opening and swallowing up her inhabitants, the rocks and mountains cleaving asunder and disclosing their subterraneous channels, their torrents of water and bituminous fire, the very breath of the nostrils of the Almighty, are all of them circumstances which fill the guilty mind with horror and dismay, and admirably express the power, the presence, and omniscience of God. To what has been stated above, I would earnestly recommend an attentive perusal of what I have written in the first volume of my complete illustration of the occult sciences, from page 71 to 80, whence it will be manifest to the full conviction of the most obstinate atheist, if such a thing can really exist, that there is a God, all-powerful and intelligent, supremely perfect, eternal and infinite, omnipotent and omniscient, who endures from eternity to eternity and is present from infinity to infinity. But though, from the nature and perfections of the deity, he is invisibly present in all places, and nothing happens without his knowledge and permission, yet it is expressly revealed in Scripture and admitted by all wise and intelligent authors, that he is visibly present with the angels and spirits and blessed souls of the departed in those mansions of bliss called heaven. There he is pleased to afford a nearer and more immediate view of himself, and a more sensible manifestation of his glory, and a more adequate perception of his attributes than can be seen or felt in any other parts of the universe. which place, for the sake of preeminent distinction, and as being the seat and center from whence all things flow and have their beginning, life, light, power, and motion, is called the interior, or empyrean heaven. The position and order of this interior heaven, or center of the divinity, has been variously described, and its locality somewhat disputed amongst the learned. But all agree as to the certainty of its existence. Hermes Trismegistus defines heaven to be an intellectual sphere, whose center is everywhere, the circumference nowhere. But by this he meant no more than to affirm what we have done above, that God is present everywhere and at all times, from infinity to infinity. That to say, without limitation, bounds, or circumference. Plato speaks of this eternal heaven in terms which bear so strict a resemblance to the books of Revelation, and in so elevated and magnificent a style, that it is apparent that heathen philosophers, notwithstanding their worshipping demi or false gods, possessed an unshaken confidence in one omnipotent, supreme, overruling power, whose throne was the center of all things and the abode of angels and blessed spirits. To describe this interior heaven in terms adequate to its magnificence and glory is utterly impossible. The utmost we can do is to collect from the inspired writers and from the words of Revelation. Assisted by occult philosophy and due knowledge of the celestial spheres, that order and position of it which reason and the divine lights we have bring nearest the truth. That God must be strictly and literally the center from whence all ideas of the divine mind flow, as rays in every direction, through all spheres and through all bodies, cannot admit of a doubt. That the inner circumference of the center is surrounded, filled, or formed by arrangements of the three hierarchies of angels, is also consonant to reason and scripture, and form what may be termed the entrance or inner gate of the empyrean heaven, through which no spirit can pass without their knowledge and permission, and within which we must suppose the vast expanse or mansions of the Godhead and glory of the Trinity to be. This is strictly comfortable with the idea of all the prophets and evangelical writers. From this primary circle or gate of heaven, Lucifer, the grand apostate, as Milton finely describes it, was hurled into the bottomless abyss, whose office as one of the highest order of angels having placed him near the eternal throne, he became competitor for dominion and power with God himself. But him the almighty power hurled headlong flaming from the ethereal sky, with hideous ruin and combustion down to bottomless perdition, there to dwell to adamantine chains and penal fire. Milton, Paradise Lost. Of nature. No one expression used by authors or spoken amongst men is in general variously applied or so little understood as the word nature. When speaking of the nature of a thing, we most commonly mean its essence, that is, the attributes or cause which makes it what it is, whether the thing be corporeal or not, as when we attempt to define the nature of a fluid, of a triangle, etc. Oftentimes we confound that which a man has by nature with what accrues to him by birth, as when we say that such a man is noble by nature. Sometimes we take nature for an internal principle of motion, as when we say that a stone by nature falls to the ground. Sometimes we understand by nature the established course and order of things. Sometimes we take nature for an aggregate of powers belonging to the same body, especially a living one, in which sense physicians say that nature is strong, weak, or spent, and that in such and such disease nature left to herself will perform the cure. Sometimes we use the term nature for the universe or whole system of the corporeal works of God, as when it is said of a phoenix or any imaginary being that there is no such thing in nature. Sometimes, too, and that no unfrequently, we express by the word nature a kind of semi-deity or supernatural spirit presiding over all things. This general abuse of the word nature is by no means peculiar to the English people or language. It prevails more or less in all countries and amongst all sects, and seems to have been copied from the fabulous ideas of the ancients. Aristotle has written a whole chapter expressly to enumerate the various acceptations of the Greek word that is written in English, nature, and among Latin writers there are not less than 15 or 16 different acceptations of the same word, with advocates out of number for their interpretation. The bulk of them insist that the word nature radically means the system of the world, the machine of the universe, or the assemblage of all created beings, in which sense they speak of the author of nature and call the sun the eye of nature, because he illuminates the universe, and the father of nature because he warms the earth and makes it fruitful. Others, understanding the word in a more confined sense, apply it to each of the several kinds of beings, created and uncreated, spiritual and corporeal. Thus they say divine nature, angelical nature, human nature, meaning all men together who possess the same spiritual reasonable soul. In this sense, the schoolmen and divines say natura naturans and natura naturata, speaking of God who is the natura naturans, as giving being and nature to all others, in opposition or distinction to the creatures, who are the natura naturata, as receiving their nature from the hands of another. Nature, in a still more limited sense, is used for the essence of a thing, according to which the Cartesians say it is the nature of the soul to think, and the nature of matter consists in extension. Others more properly use the word nature for the established order and course of material things, the series of second causes, or the laws which God has imposed on every part of the creation, in which sense it is that they say nature makes the night precede the day, nature has rendered respiration necessary to life, etc. According to which St. Thomas speaks of nature as a kind of divine art, communicated to beings which direct and carry them to the ends they were intended for, in which sense nature can be neither more nor less than a concatenation of causes and effects, or that order and economy which God has established in all parts of his creation. Others still more strictly consider nature as the action of providence, and the principle of all things, or that spiritual power or being which is diffused throughout the creation and moves and acts in all bodies and gives them peculiar properties and produces peculiar effects. In this sense, our modern philosopher, Mr. Boyle, considers nature as nothing else but God acting himself, according to certain laws he himself has fixed. This corresponds very much with the opinion of a sect of ancient philosophers who made nature the god of the universe, whom they conceived to preside over and govern all things. But this they acknowledged to be only an imaginary being, and that nature meant no more than the qualities or virtues which God implanted in his creatures, but which their poets and orators had figuratively personified as a god. Aristotle, with a view of concentrating these ideas of nature into one point, as best adapted to the works of an infinitely perfect and all-powerful being, defines nature principium et causa motus et jus in quo est primo per se, et non per accidens, which definition being mistaken by the Stoics, they from hence conceive the principle of nature to be a certain spirit or virtue diffused throughout the universe, which gave everything its motion by the invariable order of inevitable necessity, without liberty or knowledge. This induced the idea of a plastic nature, which several learned modern writers have described to be an incorporeal created substance, imbued with a vegetative life, but not with sensation or thought, penetrating the whole created universe, being co-extended with it and under God, moving matter so as to produce the phenomena, which cannot be solved by mechanical laws, active for ends unknown to itself, not being conscious of its own actions, and yet having an obscure idea of the action to be entered upon. In support of this plastic nature, Dr. Cudworth argues thus: Since neither all things are produced fortuitously or by the unguided mechanism of matter, nor God himself may reasonably be thought to do all things immediately and miraculously, it may well be concluded that there is a plastic or formative nature under him, which as an inferior and subordinate instrument executes that part of his providence which consists in the regular motion of matter, yet so as that there is also, besides this, a higher providence to be acknowledged, which, presiding over it, doth often supply the defects of it, and sometimes overrule it, forasmuch as this plastic nature cannot act electively nor with discretion. This doctrine he conceives had the suffrage of the best philosophers of all ages, Aristotle, Plato, Empedocles, Heraclitus, Hippocrates, Zeno, and the Stoics, and the latter Platonists and Peripatetics, as well as the chemists and Paracelsians, and several modern writers. Now, I am clearly of the opinion that notwithstanding these great authors have so obstinately contended for the definition of the word, and for the principles and construction of nature, yet they all in reality meant one and the same thing, only giving different explanations of the same ideas. And if their arguments are closely pursued and compared with each other, they will all tend to show that the anima mundi, or soul of the universe, was that they meant by nature. This anima mundi, as we have seen before, is a medium investing the whole interior heavens and consists of a pure ethereal substance or spirit, which, as it is more immediately resides in the celestial regions, in the second or next cause under God that moves and governs the heavens and the heavenly bodies, stars and planets, which bodies, having received their first existence from the fecundity of the same spirit, in the act of creation are by an influx of sympathetic rays and by light, heat, gravity, and motion, nourished and sustained, upheld and continued in the same regular course and in the beautiful order we see them. From the celestial regions, the same influx of pure ethereal spirit descends into every part of the immeasurable space, and is diffused through the mass of this world, informing, actuating, and uniting the different parts thereof into various substances. And being the primary source of life, everywhere breathing a spirit like itself, it pervades all elementary bodies, and intimately mixing with all the minute atoms thereof, constitutes the power or instrument we call nature, forming, fashioning, and propagating all things, conformable to the ideas or will of the divine mind in the first act of creation.